After we discuss the distribution of plankton, both phytoplankton, primary producers, and then the zooplankton, the first very small creatures that eat them, the next major group of organisms on planet Earth that we typically discuss are those that are benthic. Benthic are the organisms that live either on or in the bottom, and then there are a few of the relevant facts about them. They are closely tied to the surface chlorophyll distribution, which is, of course, tied to primary productivity, meaning that most of these things are found on the continental shelves, but they are found everywhere else as well. And then because virtually all of them have larval stages of different lengths, the distribution of these organisms is strongly affected by surface currents. So first let's look at the benthic zone. The benthic organisms, or the benthos, live in the benthic zone, which, as you can see in this diagram, is this long arrow that sort of mirrors the bottom. Basically, anywhere there is a water substrate interface, that black line, we have the potential for benthic creatures to live in this benthic zone. Here's just another picture of the same thing. The benthic here is shown as sort of this dogleg diagram, meaning again the boundary between the substrate, the sediment, and the overlying water. These other terms, pelagic, epipelagic of different types and all that, those are going to become relevant for us when we talk about pelagic creatures in time for the last exam. As I mentioned before, the distribution of benthic organisms is closely tied to the distribution of chlorophyll and therefore primary productivity. So if you were to compare this map, say, with the maps that we had in the previous lectures on primary productivity, you'd see a pretty tight match. Look at the low spots being the central parts of the gyre and the higher parts hugging the continents, and then the few places where there are extensive upwelling regions, we have higher benthic biomass still. So let's define the benthic life habit. It is either life on top of the ocean bottom or within it. We segregate that by these two terms, epifaunal and infaunal. And as it says there, this encompasses every possible environment from the shallowest water to the deepest ocean trenches. The two pictures you're looking at, the upper one is an epifaunal creature. These are surf clams, and they spend their life right there at the interface between the sediment and the water. The lower picture are lingula. This is a type of brachiopod, and you're looking at the side of an aquarium, and you can see where these organisms have burrowed into the sediment. They have sort of a hard shell in the upper part and sort of a wormy muscular extension at the bottom that they look like they're doing pogo stick motion. They kind of, it contracts and they bob up and down with this. And so these are the two primary ways of doing it, but notice both are intimately tied to the sediment, to the substrate. This cartoon shows both. So you've got the starfish and the crab, which are epifaunal creatures, scooting along on top of the bottom, and then you have this polychaete worm and this clam, which live within the bottom in these burrows. So epifaunal, infaunal, and then incidentally, the plants here that they list as macroalgae, seaweed, sometimes we call that epifloral. There is a latitudinal variation, interestingly enough, between the infauna and the epifauna. Infauna richness, so this is average number of species richness. Notice as you go from the poles, Arctic, subarctic, temperate, tropic, it's, boy, as steady as you can get. The amount or the number of species is pretty constant. Epifaunal richness, by contrast, is inversely proportional with latitude, meaning as latitude goes up, as you go from, say, 0 degrees at the equator to the poles, the percentage or the sheer number, this is number, of species of epifaunal creatures declines. And then conversely, the other way is true. If you go from the poles to the tropics, you get more and more and more and more epifaunal species. These species can be described as well by their ability to move. So we have these terms vagile and sessile. Vagile simply means mobile. It's able to move, even if that motion is very slow. You're looking at a conus snail shell up here, and as we know, the snails define slow. If you say something moves at a snail's pace, that's very slow. So they are our metaphor for slow moving, but it's still moving. In the oceans, though, we also have a whole bunch of things that are sessile or immobile. And so when you look at these things here, you've got corals, sponges, bryozoans, a lot of these things, they have cemented themselves to the bottom, and they don't move. Now, this thing might wave around as an ocean current sort of goes through it, and sometimes they might even sort of wave, tentacles off of these things, but the organism itself is cemented to the bottom. We also need to talk about individuality. So mobility is moving about, but then individuals is a different concept, and this is very important for the oceans. I'm using the same exact pictures here. Solitary organisms are like you and I, single individual entities. If you pick one up, it is a single individual, and this can be either benthic, planktic, or nectic. Colonial creatures, by contrast, are a group of genetic clones that continually bud off of one another, and they are attached to one another. So when you look at this coral in this lower picture, this purple coral, you might say, well, that's one coral. It's one coral colony. If you were actually to zoom in, there would be thousands upon thousands upon thousands of little teeny tiny holes in this structure, and every one of them would have a little organism, a little polyp growing out of it, and every one of those little organisms is a genetic clone of the one next to it, of all of them in this entire organism here. So it's a colony. We don't really have colonies like this on land. So you could talk about colonies of bees or colonies of ants, but all of the members of those colonies are still solitary individuals. In the oceans, this has just become a common way of adaptation where there's a natural selection advantage for developing these colonies like this. And there are different ways in which they feed, some unique adaptations of feeding in the benthic creatures. First would be suspension feeding. The ocean water itself is filled with all kinds of small planktic creatures, both plants and animals, dead decaying matter floating around, individual particles of sediment kind of moving around, and you have all different creatures that have adapted ways to grab this food or filter it out of the water. We don't have that on land, really. We have no food flying around in the air that we kind of open our mouths and catch. About the closest thing would be spiders that sort of, they'll make a big web and they'll catch flies and other flying insects that kind of buzz through and get caught in it. Is similar, but it's different. Just a different way of doing this thing. Also in the oceans, you have lots of organisms that have adapted to a life of what we call deposit feeding or detrital feeding. They literally are eating the mud. So they eat in mud rich with organic material and poop out cleaner mud. And then, of course, we have lots of different scavengers or croppers, things that are just constantly moving around on the bottom or through the bottom, cleaning up and getting their food matter that way. Again, just a couple more slides reiterating this, suspension feeding. And you see here there's both epifaunal creatures doing this. You see the little particles, the food particles are drawn as black dots. These are moving through here, and then you've got infaunal creatures doing this as well. And then here, of course, is deposit feeding, and these are organisms that are literally eating the sediment as you go here. Other adaptations of benthic creatures, all kinds of special gills and filters and respiratory feeding appendages that keep them upright, keep them away from being buried, the possibility of being buried by sediment. Remember, they're living where sedimentation is active, so they constantly have to grow upright or keep themselves clean. So some little creatures like bryozoans have all different little scrapers and shifters and little shovel-like appendages that keep themselves clean. They have a life of interesting development. So even all those beautiful large creatures that we think of as benthic creatures, corals, crabs, snails, clams, etc., at some point they are in their development. Early on, they hatch from eggs and they are distributed as larvae through the water column. Now they're at the mercy of the currents. The currents take them around, but there's a whole bunch of different cues that determine where an organism will settle, and these larvae will go down. They literally will test the water in multiple ways, so they need to be in areas of enough light, the right temperature, the right bottom texture, and you'll see some of these will go down and literally feel the bottom, and if it's not, let's say if it's not the sand that they are optimally adapted for, they will go back up into the water column and keep swimming. It's a very interesting style of life. Just some pictures of different planktic larval forms. They look vastly different than the adult versions. So brittle stars, blue crabs, there's a snail larvae, polychaete larvae, all of these being millimeter or sub-millimeter scale, as it says here, magnified 35 to 55 times. And they have this early stage of life in the oceans as larvae, but ultimately they settle and go to the bottom. Now among larvae we have two different major types. There's more than this, but you can sort of divide them into two big groups. There are the leucistrophs, and these are larvae that their parents have endowed them with a large yolk sac for them to feed upon. So they are ejected from the bodies of their parent organisms. They have a large yolk sac, so they don't necessarily have to feed while they are plankton. They have a food source with them, so they float off. They're heavier, they're larger, they don't settle terribly far from their parents, so they have a restricted dispersal phase. Larval types of the other major form are called planktotrophic, and these are larvae that are spit out, first of all, in much, much larger numbers, and they either have no egg yolk sac or a very small one, so they have to feed while they are in the plankton, meaning those little planktic microscopic creatures have to eat other little planktic microscopic creatures and plants. And some of these can have an extended swim or float time of many, many weeks. And people have done all kinds of experiments where they have limited them or prevented them from settling. And sometimes you can keep these things going for months until they get basically so large that they absolutely must settle. But they potentially then can cross huge ocean basins. So these larvae can get into, say, a giant ocean current, and if it's traveling over a large ocean, deep ocean bottom, bottom is miles below, there's no chance of settling, they will stay viable and active until this ocean current delivers them to some shallow, appropriate bottom, appropriate environmental condition situation elsewhere. The next couple of slides are just sort of general trends or general factors about living on the bottom. These are just here for your edification, not necessarily important for us as far as testing is concerned. I want to get to the communities themselves. And so we have several different types of communities, and we're going to start from the shallowest areas on the shoreline where the ocean meets the land and go down from there. And first we have the rocky shores. And rocky shores are among the very best known communities in all of ecology, because a lot of actual ecology science began on studying rocky shorelines. It's a very unique situation. You have lots and lots of epifauna that are things that are attached to the substrate, algae, barnacles, snails, all kinds of things, as well as other creatures that are moving over this seafloor. As it says there, that's generally a moderate diversity of things. They are greatest at the tropical latitudes, but for animals, but algae at mid-latitudes. Interesting segregation here. And we know so much about these because so many great universities, both in the United States and in Europe, are very, very close to rocky shorelines. Think about the bulk of the California coastline, Washington, Oregon, all the great universities there. On the East Coast, MIT, Rutgers, etc., things on near rocky shores there. In Europe, you've got all kinds of rocky shore exposed around Scotland. The University of Edinburgh is very well known for its work on rocky shore communities. And rocky shore communities sometimes are said to be vertically zoned. So here is a rocky shoreline, and you have the line of the highest high tide, the lowest low tide. You have organisms that above this high tide line, they are still considered marine organisms, but generally they'll go through their entire lives and very rarely actually be covered by water. They live and exist on the sea spray and the splashing of water more so than they do actually being in the water. You've got the intertidal area, or the littoral zone, and these creatures, you have a lot of creatures, see them like barnacles, limpets, mussels. They've adapted to life where half of the day, or half of their lives, you can scale it up any way you want, they are underwater when the tide is in, and the other half of the day, half of their lives, they are completely exposed to the air. And so you've got all these adaptations for closing themselves up, locking themselves up tight to maintain their moisture during this low tide period. And then below this lowest low tide line, you start what we call the sublittoral zone, and you have creatures here that are adapted to completely different lifestyles as well. Just another picture of essentially the same thing from a different textbook. You've got the spray zone, or what we sometimes call the supratidal zone. You've got the highest high tide, lowest high tide, middle tide. Here they kind of divide the tide up into many different sort of categories. But again, you see the same zonation of organisms over here. And interestingly enough, even though you might have different species, you can look at, say, two sides of a giant ocean basin, like both sides of the Atlantic, and you would have the same organisms, same genera, let's say, same type of organisms in the same place in both of them. So barnacles inhabit a very specific zone. Limpets inhabit a very specific zone. Chitons, a very specific zone. In Europe, say on the Scottish coast, and then you go all the way over to Maine, the Maine coast, there would be different species, some species the same, but a lot of different species, but the same standard zonation. In this spray zone, you have all kinds of organisms that are avoiding drying out. Here are these periwinkle snails, and they have this ability to cement themselves down tight as the tide goes out. Interesting. In the high tide zone, we have limpet creatures like this and barnacles, etc. In the middle tide zone, we start getting more algae where plants can be submerged for extended periods of time, more soft-bodied organisms. And then as you get into the lowest tide zones, you get many more algal types, and then lots of more organisms scooting around there. Rocky shores are contrasted with sandy shores, so soft sandy beach environments. Here you have a lot more infaunal creatures because there is no stable or fixed surface. It's constantly being shifted by waves, by shallow surface currents, And so burrowing gives them a more stable environment this way. These things are sometimes said to be horizontally zoned. And so here's a picture of a sandy shore. And notice we use a lot of the same terms, supratidal for this spray zone, and then high tide, middle tide, low tide, subtide. But rather than being zoned, as we say, vertically, they're zoned horizontally. Some same creatures, but in general different. And as before, if you have sort of a standard zonation of organism types from shoreline out to the deep, you can have this worldwide in basins if you have the same general environment. Different adaptations for this. You have all kinds of burrowing creatures, and so here we've got bivalve mollusks, clams, and they have unique features, this muscular foot that contracts and expands and will literally suck the organism down into the sediment. Annelid worms. Here's another, this is a razor clam, and here it is partially exposed. And sometimes they can be sort of infaunal and epifaunal, both in and out, but as long as they're tucked in there, we call them infaunal creatures. Polychaete worm, they create burrows that have two openings. They segregate it this way, where you've got the water and food that they suck in at one hole, and then the cleaned water and poop that they spew out the other way. Heart urchins, another group that has adapted a unique lifestyle in this sandy bottom. And then all kinds of crustaceans that scoot along on the top, but also sort of burrow in as well. Not all non-rocky environments are sandy. A lot of them can be just mud. And as you might imagine, you'd have different creatures there as well. Now, as you go into the offshore area, you can also talk about sort of firm bottoms, rocky bottoms, and soft bottoms. And again, because of the prominence of California universities, we know quite a bit about this particular offshore environment called the Rocky Bottom Offshore Kelp Forest Community. And these are very, very unique organisms. It's basically a seaweed that can grow very, very fast. We literally call them forests because they grow to tree size, enormous, and they do this very fast. A huge amount of productivity, and lots of organisms live there both for shelter and for food. Very unique communities. You can look at these mapped globally, and the kelp with air bladders shown in red. These are the kelp that do the very, very fast growing and grow to giant tree type sizes. The shrub kelp are smaller, but you see then again there's a distribution of these things around the globe. Also offshore you get some interesting creatures in the rocky bottoms offshore, particularly again you might imagine off the coasts of Maine, Newfoundland, and Canada. Lobsters, some of these things can be gigantic, and they can either be active carnivores, but generally they're scavengers. Giant arthropod crustaceans scooting along the bottom. Oyster banks. This is a unique type of hard bottom or rocky bottom, and they, in fact, they make the rocky bottom. Oysters can be so abundant that they literally will cement themselves all together. That's their lifestyle, and they form a rocky bottom in succession that then allows all kinds of other creatures like these barnacles, this oyster drill snail, to come along and live there as well. A unique community in this bottom. Coral reefs, of course, coral reefs, and I hope that you've had a chance to look at the video I put up of Desert Seas, which talks about coral reefs in the Red Sea and elsewhere. That wonderful David Attenborough narration for you. And coral reefs are a very unique type of organism or community, a benthic community that exists worldwide. Clearly a tropical distribution for this thing. Here's this diversity number of reef-building coral genera. And again, we have them in the Atlantic, but you can see it is mostly what we call an Indo-Pacific distribution. So here in the Western Pacific and into the Indian Ocean, we have the highest diversity of these things. And that video, Desert Sea by David Attenborough, it is in the modules for you. You see it deals with an area that is particularly high in diversity for coral. So just a few things that you ought to know, that coral reef development, the building of this community is very specific. You have very unique conditions that need to be met. You need to have warm water, but not superheated water. This is why they are very susceptible to the ongoing global warming and intense heating of tropical waters. You need sunlight because most of these corals also have symbiotic algae as part of their body. So literally within their tissues, they have embedded algal cells that photosynthesize and provide additional food for the corals besides what they are grabbing themselves. You need strong waves or currents. This is mostly for the constant oxygenation of the water, developing high or providing high oxygen content for the organisms to grow, as well as providing food. The food's constantly moving by. Normal salinities, hard substrate, all of those things. The symbiosis is an interesting factor in and of itself, and we can talk about either hermotypic corals or what we sometimes call ahermotypic. And hermotypic corals have developed this unique relationship with this algae. And then we also have, well, sometimes we call them mixotrophs. So unique situation. There is a zonation of coral reefs. It is a rocky shore, a rocky bottom community. And so we can talk about a vertical zonation as well as a horizontal zonation for these things. And as you might imagine, they grow enormous. Think about the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, literally tens of thousands of square miles of coral reef growth, and you have the active coral reef growing, you have ancient areas, you have areas that they're zoned very, very specifically across here. We're not going to take the time to look at all of the different zonations and unique ecologies along a coral reef. And again, I'm pushing it again, make sure you watch that Desert Sea video. The importance, well, all kinds of importance, of course. Huge diversity of species. I'd put stars by this one. This is probably the biggest. Sometimes they're called the rainforest of the seas. So if we think of rainforests as places on land that have huge numbers of species, the coral reefs are the equivalent. We love them for our tourists, diving, all of that kind of stuff, but they're important in other ways too. They provide very important either places for adult fisheries or juvenile refugia. Regardless, either way, they are places where we have lots of fish that we eat at one way or another. And then, of course, in a geologic sense, these things protect the shoreline. So if giant storms are coming in across the ocean basins here, if there weren't this huge edifice of coral reef, basically giant rocky masses of limestone, again, thousands of square miles possible, blocking this, then those waves and the storm surge and the high winds and everything would attack the land and erode the land in a huge way. Here, most of this energy ends up being spent on the reef crest and the reef slope area. Put this one in here just to talk about it briefly. Corals, though, are in decline for many reasons. And one of the reasons, they have a natural predator, this crown of thorns sea star. This is a starfish. Doesn't necessarily look like it here. And normally this thing exists in specific numbers, and it goes around and it literally will pluck the coral polyps, individual clones out of each of these coral colonies. But for some times of the year, sometimes in several years, you have huge outbreaks. For whatever reason, these things skyrocket in numbers, and they want to eat, so they decimate the reefs. This may or may not be closely tied to human activities and, of course, climate change, but regardless, it's a huge part of the decline of reefs. And then finally here, just we look at reefs as sort of a canary in a coal mine. They are a good indicator of overall health of the environment, and if that is the case, then the environments in the ocean are in trouble. So if just look at these two sort of timelines here, 41% healthy in 2000 and far less today. 1/3 of all corals are at high risk for extinction. All these other things, humans, we're the greatest threat. We are increasing the climate, the heat in the atmosphere, which is overheating the oceans. We are acidifying the oceans. Our activities, from fishing to building to getting rid of waste, they're all actively moving to help these communities decline and disappear.